All right, so welcome back from your Labor Day weekend. So first of all, just a quick poll of the room. Who knows what Labor Day is? Why we have Labor Day? Most of the time we don't know. Oftentimes I get them confused with Memorial Day, right? Labor Day, Memorial Day, like you have time off, but like why? Right? What you raise your hand a little bit.
I would assume that Labor Day is a way for companies and like the government to thank workers for their labor.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, that's kind of a perspective of it. Absolutely. Yeah, in the back.
So like some people say like you can't wear white after Labor Day. I think it's more like a new beginning, like a different thing. Like everyone was on vacation, now it's time for everyone to get back to work, and it would symbolize what we're about to start with.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so I think that expression just took Labor Day as a point. Because fashions change in the spring and the fall and the summer, and you know what I mean. And so Labor Day is just a nice point, demarcation between the summer and the fall. But what actually ended up happening was labor standards in the Industrial Revolution were atrocious. We're talking 12-hour days. We're talking 7 days a week. We're talking, children, elderly people, right? So, essentially almost all of us would have had to work in a factory or would have had to work on the farm or whatever, right? If there weren't these child labor laws in effect. And that's how it was. There was a factory in England that they would brag about how efficient they were by saying that their beds were never cold. Because essentially they had like all these 7-year-old boys working in shifts of 3. As soon as one worker would get up from sleeping 8 hours, the other workers would get off their shift and they'd go sleep. And so they would brag about how their beds were never cold. That's how efficient they were. And so it was a really oppressive system. And it all came to a head at the end of the 19th century with something called the Pullman strike. And, essentially these workers, they kept on getting their pay decreased, even though the quality of their work had increased. And so they went on strike, and the capitalists, the people that own the factories and everything like that, right? They were very violent against them, right? So the whole thing ended up being incredibly violent, which is we're seeing similar kind of things right now, but for different reasons, right? And so Labor Day was actually it was mandated by Congress to be the first Monday or the second Monday in September to remember that Pullman strike and to kind of remember the terrible labor standards that we almost just like come to think of as a necessary evil. You know what I mean? Like it just and we kind of woke up and demanded this 40-hour work week. The notion of a weekend. Weekends didn't exist before, right? I mean, there was Sunday, which was the Lord's Day, but weekends as they exist now, did not exist. So all of that stuff is all a relatively new innovation that happened, 125 years ago or whatever, right? And it really came to a head because of this really bloody thing called the Pullman strike. So, capital and labor have been fighting, and then finally the government came in and said, no, you quit it. No, and kind of set down some rules so that hopefully they could get along better and, proceed to produce things in a more amicable way. Does that make sense to everybody now? So, yeah, it's easy to not think about it or just confuse them or whatever, but it's actually an important day. Because it's like 9/11 in a way, right? It's like it's memorializing, dead people and kind of this terrible thing that happened, and hopefully, we alter our behavior or we alter our awareness so that such things won't happen again, right? Okay, so real quick, let's get to the topic at hand after my 5-minute Labor Day rant. So we're talking about market failures and everything like that, right? We're talking about taxes. We were talking about, we have proportional taxes, right? Which means, the more money you make, you're still getting taxed the same amount of money. We have regressive taxes where the more money you make, the less you're actually getting taxed, right? So we talked about how payroll tax, the Social Security tax, it only takes tax out of the first chunk of your income. And so as you make more and more income, you end up paying the same amount of money, so it's a lower percentage of your total income, right? And the last one that we're going to talk about, which is probably the most confusing, right, is income taxes, right? And so this is a regressive tax, and how the heck does it actually work, right? So I went ahead and I wrote a little table out here for us. This is the same as table 5.4 in page 128 of your book. So page 128, and then table 5.4. So we're going to use that same information from there, right? And so this is all about 2016. So all this information is good for 2016. So we would, at the bottom here, we would kind of go star for 2016. And then we're talking specifically about a married couple filing jointly. All right, so real quick, why do we have to talk about the dates, right? Well, these rates, they change over time. When President Trump, that was one of the first things that they did during his administration, right? Was lower the tax rates. And so this is talking about the tax rates before President Trump started his administration, and those tax rate decreases happened, right? And then we're talking about why do we have to give this other kind of qualifier, right? Married filing jointly, right? Well, if you're filing as a single individual, there's different cutoffs. And so this is assuming that, it's a typical US family unit, right? It's two parents and maybe kids or whatever, right? But so it's saying two people, so two incomes is kind of the gist of it, right? And they're filing together. So they're filing as if they were one total entity. So we're talking about the combined income of two different people here when we're talking about the taxable income, okay? And so when we talk about the first $18,000, the first $18,000 is only taxed at 10%. And so what does that mean? That means that the total tax from this income that I'm going to get is going to be $1,800 and 55 bucks. And so this one's easy, right? Our average tax rate is going to be the same as the marginal tax rate. But that average is going to change, right? Because the way that income tax works, you're taxed so much on that first chunk of money you make. And then, so that's what the first, 2-3 months of the year, something like that, right? And then as soon as you start making, $20,000, $30,000, right? As soon as you start making over that, all of the monies that you make over $18,000, but less than $75,000, that gets taxed at a different rate of 15%. And so the total taxes here, $10,368. And so then to get our average, we're just taking this 10,000 and we're dividing it by the total income. So we're dividing by that 75,000, and we end up with a 14% average tax rate there, right? So a little bit less than that 15%, because why? They're only paying 10% on the first $18,000. Why is it not closer to 10%? Well, because we're assuming, right, this is saying the average tax rate when you're kind of maxed out, when you're at the cap. When maxed out bracket-wise, maxed bracket. When you max out that bracket, so these are the brackets right here, right? This is the low income bracket. These are some of the medium income brackets, and this is the high income brackets, right? These ones are low income, high income. When you talk about high income tax brackets, right? That's what they're talking about. They're talking about people that together make $150,000 to $230,000 a year, right? So that's an individual salary of what? $75,000 to $105,000 a year, right? I mean, that's That's still plenty more than the average income. So again, what's the gist of this? Well, we've got different tax rates at different amounts, right? So now it jumps up. As soon as you start making over 75,000, now the government says, okay, well, now you can afford to give me 25% of all that money above that $75,000. And so then the total tax on the highest income in the bracket, right, is going to be 29,518. To get that average, we're taking the 29,518, we're dividing it by the 152,000, right? And so we're going to end up with an average tax rate of 19%. And so I'm just going to fill in these other ones, and well, I'm not going to do all of them though, because I mean, you guys get the gist, right? So this one's 51,792. So it's a 22% effective tax rate. And so this is when we talk about the effective tax rate, right? Effective. So a lot of times you'll talk about, you have people saying, oh, well, the tax rate is already, because if you go down, to all the money that's over $466,950, right? For all of that, there's a marginal tax rate of 39.6%. So, getting pretty close to half, right? In terms of what they're taking. But we have to keep in mind that this is only the income after $500,000 that you made that year. And we also have to keep in mind too, right? This is just income. This is just stuff you made. For a lot of these people that are making 466, they're making a ton more in capital gains and other things like that, right? And so we have to remember, this is all just income. Most of the really wealthy people, right? Most of the 1% and the 1% of the 1%, right? They are dealing with capital gains taxes, which is a flat rate. It's just 15% on whatever you make on the gains, right? So on the gains, you can talk about gains or losses, right? So if you buy a stock at $100, goes up to $200, that's $100 worth of gains. And so you have to give the federal government $15 of that $100. Which, it sucks, right? But it's better than giving them $40, which is what it would be if they didn't have that capital gains tax exemption and you were making that money in the $500,000 to $1 million range, right? And so I just want you guys to be armed with the correct vocabulary, right? That's a big kind of goal of my class here, right? And so when people are bitching about, oh, they're already taxing them so high at 39 point, yeah, but the average tax rate there is, it goes up to 27 and then it's 28, right? And we can't really figure it out because it's top coded. The person could be making $2 million. You know what I mean? But essentially, that average rate doesn't really approach. It's going to take a lot of friggin' money for that to get close to that 39.6%, right? So the actual tax rate that a lot of these, millionaires and stuff like that are getting taxed for their income, if they're working at all. Again, that's a big if they have any income, because a lot of times if you're that wealthy, why are you working? You got your money working for you. It's making money for you. Then their effective tax rate, right, which is much more indicative of what's actually happening, is going to be much lower. So any questions on that? All right. So in addition to providing public goods, in addition to collecting tax revenues, right, the government also has this responsibility or has this role, and this is kind of controversial, right? You have libertarian or Austrian kind of a wing of the philosophical or political spectrum say that the government should only be responsible for collecting taxes, enforcing contracts, and defending people, right? And the social spending and all the the safety nets, social security, all that stuff is a big waste of money. And if the government didn't do it, then people would do it themselves, right? That's kind of their philosophy, their theory. They would also argue that it's not the government's role to correct what's called market failures, right? So market failure is that sawdust example, right? When they just dumped all the sawdust into the rivers, and then all the fish were dying and stuff like that, right? And so the government came in and said, you can't do that with the sawdust anymore. They had to pay to get it taken away. Some guy was like, oh wait, there's this new glue. I can take the sawdust and the little bits that they're paying me to take away, and I can press them together and make particle board, made a new invention out of it, ended up making a crap ton of money, right? That was the result of the government stepping in and interfering with the private market, right? And saying, hey, there's a failure here. There are some negative externalities. There's some, there are some people that aren't involved in your transaction that are getting all caught up in it, right? The water in the Ogallala reservation, is full of uranium from the uranium mining that happened, 150 miles away, right? And so the government comes in and corrects that by either taxing the operation, they might stop it. They might prescribe something like with the coal plants. They said you have to have these certain types of smokestack things that decrease the amount of these are the kind you just have to have. That works sometimes, but then what about when the government comes in, they try to fix something like catalytic converters, right? So sometimes their fixes become very antiquated very fast, right? And so just keep in mind that there's both over-regulation and under-regulation, right? In different aspects of the economy, and it's far too simple to just kind of wave a hand and say that everything is all over-regulated or everything is all under-regulated, right? When it's much more of a case-by-case basis. And at the end of it too, we also have to keep in mind that these politicians, they're people that are looking to get reelected, right? And so sometimes they're acting in their own strategic interests rather than the actual interests of their constituents, right? Which is unfortunate, but that's just the reality that we have. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to act accordingly, right? Hurrah for the perfect world, but we don't live it. Okay, let's get back to chapter 6. So that was the finishing up of chapter 5. Let's get back to chapter 6. We're going to talk about businesses and their costs. So this is one of those kind of really important chapters, just as we're laying down a foundation that we're really going to pick up in chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9. So this is one of those things where if these terms aren't making sense to you, I really do implore you to come to office hours, send me an email. I can, find more videos on YouTube and put them up so that help, somebody else explain them a different way. So it's real important for us to understand what's happening here, right? And so let's jump right in. So last time we talked about, we defined corporations and stocks, all that other kind of stuff, right? Now we're going to talk about economic costs. And so when we talk about costs, we're used to talking about explicit costs, right? We're used to talking about the payments for the resources that you need, right? So any kind of payments for resources, these are the explicit costs. Implicit costs, these are essentially the next best alternative, right? So this is, your foregone wages. Let's say you decide to quit your job and start your own business, right? Well, what is the cost of that business? The cost is going to be, maybe you want to start a Chadron DoorDash, right? Where, all you do is you just go to different, different restaurants. So you go to Walmart or whatever, right? And you'll just, get stuff for somebody for $5, right? And so you might need to buy a car. You might need to buy some extra insurance. You might need to buy some Facebook advertising, right? These are all explicit costs. You're paying for crap. But what about your time? If you weren't trying to do this, what could you have been doing? You could have been working at Domino's or Walmart or Safeway, so you could have been earning a wage in that time, right? So these are a different kind of costs. Because remember, cost is just something you're giving up to get something else, right? So these are implicit. So we're probably a bit more familiar with this word because of everything going on with the Black Lives Matter, right? You know, implicit bias, right? So implicit is this notion that it's not necessarily on the surface, right? But it's still there. You know, it's latent, right? It's right behind. It's still very influential, and it's right behind the veneer, right? So what's another kind of implicit cost? Another kind of implicit costs. What if, so when I was your guys' age, or a little bit younger actually, I tricked my parents into I convinced them that I was learning to be a locksmith, right? But I really just wanted to learn how to pick locks, you know? And you know, but of course, I didn't want them to be all like suspicious, you know, so I was, oh, I'm going to be a locksmith in college, there, right? And you know, of course, I got like actually curious about what it would cost to be a locksmith and everything like that, right? And it costs a lot of money because you have to be like insured and bonded, right? Bonded means you have to put a chunk of money up so that if shit goes wrong, the person, like, so like plumbers, you'll see this on trucks now if you're looking, licensed, like bonded and insured, right? Because if they screw up your house, you want there to be some money to fix it, you know? And at the end of the day, if they're not bonded, the way in which so remember we talked about corporations, we talked about different corporate ownership. Well, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's just important for you guys to know. There's ways to arrange corporations so that you as the business owner essentially have like no liability. Like none. So it's called a limited liability corporation. They're all over the place. I don't know why they exist really at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Like there's no reason for you to be anything else but a limited liability corporation. You know, if you're operating as a sole proprietorship, they can come after your house. They can come after your cars, right? So if you're just operating as a person that's just running a business by yourself, that's called a sole proprietorship. And so if, you know, somebody comes onto your property and trips and injures themselves or something like that, right? Or your business, there's a great scene in New Girl about this. Then I love New Girl. Then they can sue you, and you're going to be liable for that. It's when Schmidt had all the extra stuff, and the guy came in, and yeah, you guys are tonight. Okay, cool. So if he had an LLC, he wouldn't have been responsible for that. All right, continuing on. So we have implicit, explicit. So this is also going to be, so if I needed to be bonded, this would be the foregone interest. Right? So if I have to put $100,000 up so that I can be a plumber or a locksmith or something, right? Well, I could have taken $100,000, I could have put it in the stock market, and it would have done gangbusters the last few years or something, right? And so I could have made money on the money that I've invested in the company. Okay? And so at the end of the day, when we talk about, like, we're used to talking about accounting profit. Right? We're used to talking about accounting profit, and so essentially we got a chunk. That's our total revenue. Sorry. And that's split in between two parts, right? We've got accounting costs. Those are all the explicit costs, right? We can also think of them as accounting costs, explicit costs. And then we've got the profit, right? We've got the profit. So this is kind of the old way of thinking, right? What I need you guys to be thinking instead is I need you to be thinking about the fact that that same total revenue, and I did a terrible job of drawing it, but it should be the same. So when you want them the same, you just do like a little dash through it, and that makes it the same, even if you draw it really crappy. So the same total revenue, when we look at it from the economic lens, right, we're going to end up with those same accounting costs, or as the explicit costs. But now this whole thing is not profit. right? Now there's some of it that's my opportunity costs of my time and my money. So there's some implicit cost there too. And then what I'm left over with, we can't call it just profit, right? That would be too confusing. So we have to introduce a new term, of course. This is going to be called my economic profit. And yes, as you can see, our economic profit is always going to be less than or equal to our accounting profit. Profit is always used, a pi is used to abbreviate profit. Don't worry about that. So if you guys ever see pi somewhere and you're like, what the heck, why is pi coming out of nowhere? It's because we use it to represent profit. We never use it to represent the ratio of the circumference of a circle and its diameter or whatever, right? They just use it to, it's profit. Maybe because like the whole bigger part of the pie, piece of the pie kind of thing, right? I don't know. Somebody thought it was cute at one point, and it's just stuff. So if we're going to talk about profits, we're going to talk about costs, we're going to talk about operators, right? We need to really define that time period. So we already talked a little bit about the time periods, right? At the very beginning of class. But let's go over them really quickly again. And so remember that our short run is a time period too brief for a firm to alter its plant capacity. Here's where those definitions come in from last week, right? When we talk about plants, a plant could be a ranch. It doesn't need to be the plant from, you know, Homer Simpson, right? The nuclear power plant or whatever, right? It could be, a plant is any factory. A firm is any company. A plant is any place that makes stuff. So any factory, any production venue. A venue would be a better word. But of course, we haven't caught up with that. And so our short run costs, what would we imagine our short run costs would be? Short run costs, this would be, you know, whatever materials that we might need, right? The intermediate goods and raw materials. You know, electricity. Wages. These are all short run costs. What about long run? What about long run? What about when we're talking about the long run? And this is, again, it's kind of silly, but it's defined as the time period long enough for a firm to change the quantities of all resources including plant size. Kind of especially plant size, right? So in the long run, right, we're no longer held hostage by the diminishing returns that we get, and we'll talk more in detail about that later. We're going to take a quick video break because the amount of yawns in here is too damn high. So we'll take a video break and then we'll come back and pick up with short run production relationships. Riveting, I know. All right. Pause. Back to the topic at hand. So when we talk about our short run production decisions, right? Well, essentially these production costs, right? When you're from the perspective of that capitalist, of that firm owner, right? The production costs that you have to pay, they depend what? Not just on the quantity, but the quality, right? The quantity and prices of those resources needed to produce, some amount of whatever good, baseball bats, doesn't matter, some amount of goods and services. When we're talking about the production, so these are the production costs, right? But what about, let's just talk about the production themselves. We end up having a few different types of new words, right? So we've got total product, which is TP. So what is total product? This is going to be just the total quantity of that good being produced, right? So all of the output produced. We've got another term called the marginal product. The marginal product. So what are we talking about there? A new page. Talk about the marginal product. We get that as MP, and this is going to be the change in the total output. So the change, which remember is just a little triangle guy, change in the total output, right? So total product. That results from one additional input resource. And so let's say, I went from making, 2,000 baseball bats a day to 5,000 baseball bats a day by adding an extra worker. What's my marginal product of that extra worker? It would be the 3,000, right? 5,000 minus 2,000 over, let's say I had 2 workers, now I have 3. 3 minus 2 is going to give me my marginal product, right? Because this is my change in my total product here in the numerator. And in the denominator, we have a change in one of my variable inputs. I want you guys, so the reason why I'm kind of doing the example and the reason why I'm not just saying 5 minus 2 or whatever, is because the book, this is it too, sorry. The book's gonna try to mess with you, right? And almost always, you're gonna have an increase in the variable unit by 1, and then every once in a while, it'll be an increase of like 2 or 3. So just be careful when you're given a table of information, make sure that the variable is increasing by 1, right? Because if it's not increasing by 1, then you gotta do an extra little step when you're calculating the marginal product. And then lastly, when we're talking about product, we've got total, we've got marginal, and we've got average. Our average product is just going to be total product divided by quantity. And this is really key to kind of keep in mind, because later on you're going to get a little confused, because like a lot of cost curves are going to come at you at the beginning of class on Thursday. And so I want you to keep in mind that anything that has average before it is just the total, right? So it's the average blank, average product. So I take the total product and I'm just dividing it by, so you take whatever that is, and you divide it by the quantity. That's always the average product. Average, and then if it's average Mickey Mouse, then you take the number of Mickey Mouses and you divide them by 2. Average sandwiches, number of sandwiches, divided by 2. All right, let's talk about one of economics' trickier concepts here, the law of diminishing returns. So the law of diminishing returns says, I need to zoom out. Nope, it doesn't say that. It says as successive units, so as we use more and more and more of something, of a variable added to a fixed input with fixed technology, and so it's saying as successive units of variable are added with these qualifications, and we'll talk about that in a second. So as that happens, the margin beyond some point, we'll talk about that graphically, beyond some point, the marginal product of additional additional units of the variable input of that same variable input will decline. So these variable, this marginal product will decline. So the easiest way to think about this, right, is we can apply this to our own lives. And we can talk about, the marginal returns from studying, right? So, if you study, so let's say study hours, and then your final grade in class or something, right? And let's say this is weekly. And so let's say your weekly study hours, let's say you're doing nothing right now. Let's say all you do is come to class and you don't look at the book and blah, 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 right? You probably, maybe, you get a C, you know what I mean? Depends on common sense, how much you're coming in with, how much you're paying attention in class, you know, that kind of stuff, right? How lucky you get with the randomized question pulls. But if you increase your study hours, right? If you increase them, then you know it goes up pretty quickly, right? You know, C plus. If we go, you know, 2, 3, if we go like something like 4 hours a week, right? Then you're probably likely to get a B. You know, if you go to, you know, something like I'm trying to think, maybe 8 hours a week, right? You get an A. But then at a certain point, you know, you can keep studying, right? You can, but you're still going to get an A, right? Like you can't get any better. So you could go, you know, you could make this a whole, you know, part-time job essentially, right? Spend 20 hours outside of class, but we're not getting any better grade. We're still just getting an A. And so at the end of at some point, the marginal production of extra study hours ends up being 0. Does that make sense to everybody? And so how is this relevant to firms, right? Well, this is relevant to firms because there's always some sort of fixed costs, always. And so firms are boxed in by this fixed cost. Let's talk about that. And so there's always limits to how much firms can increase output. And so, you know, we can take the Domino's that just opened as an example, right? You know, so the Domino's when it first opened, you know, I'm sure they probably, you know, had like, I don't know, 5 workers or something like that, right? Maybe like 2 or 3 of us, you know. And then, you know, as more and more people started to go there, right, you know, they started to hire more and more delivery drivers, more and more front desk people, front, whatever. They started to hire more managers, right, you know, and every time they increase the short run output, every time they increase the short run inputs, right, the number of delivery drivers, the number of ovens, whatever the case may be, right, they have an increase in that output. But there's going to be a certain level of pizza production where adding more drivers isn't going to do them a lick of good. It's actually just going to bring them down because they're going to increase their costs, right? So they're going to end up being what we call bottlenecks, right? And you think, you know, like we call it a bottleneck because if you think of a production process as a giant bottle, the neck is the thing that's making it so that the water is not coming out as fast as it could. And so it's a similar situation. There's a bottleneck in the production process, and this one's going to be the square footage of the Domino's, right? At a certain point, if they want to produce and push out more pies per month, they're going to have to expand. They're going to have to physically expand. At some point, hiring more workers, doing more ovens, whatever the case may be, you know, isn't going to cut it. That may be tearing down a wall, or it may be getting rid of the dine-in center. You know what I mean? Especially because of COVID and everything, right? You know, like a dine-in center is nice, but it's gotten very little use because there hasn't been any in store dining or whatever, right? So the book is quaint, right? And it says, if diminishing returns were not present, a single flower pot could grow the world's food supply. Right? We just keep giving it more water, giving it more sun, giving it more nutrients. But unfortunately, there is diminishing returns. And so the flower pot is not going to be large enough, right? Didn't have diminishing returns, we could just put all the inputs we want into the flower pot and it would just make whatever we want. What's something from our pop culture that has no diminishing returns? You guys probably don't know it. In Star Trek, they had a thing called the replicator. So Star Trek is this really old sci-fi show, and it was one of the first. It was a first in a lot of ways. It was one of the first because it was the first to have black and white cast members together in Hollywood. So I was like, whoo, wow. And then it was first too because it was this kind of depiction of this socialist utopia in the future. But part of that socialist utopia, what made it possible was this replicator technology. The fact that you could just put essentially atoms into this thing and it would just make whatever you needed, right? So there was no diminishing returns to a replicator machine. All right, so let's just jump into the curves. Okay, so because of the fact that we have this diminishing returns, right? When we look at the total production as it relates to, let's say, the quantity of laborers. And so one of the things that we also do here, and I don't know if they're doing it here. I don't think they're not. I just want to let you guys know, we usually talk about labor hours. So the book just talks about units of labor or whatever, which is fine. But the reason why labor hours is important is because not every worker is the same, right? You're going to hire some workers part-time, you're going to hire some workers full-time. You know, you're going to hire some workers that are seasonal. So by getting labor hours instead of just like the actual, like how many workers, we get a much more granular measurement. Does that make sense? So we get more information, which is what we're all about in economics, is information. And so we end up with a total production curve that looks about like this. So this is all figure 6.2 on page 147. So we get something that, you know, at first it's kind of constant and then it starts to grow a lot because of specialization. And then we hit some sort of peak. And then when we increase, we actually decrease our total product at a certain point. So we've got kind of three phases here. You know, we're talking about this first part. And for any of you calculus nerds there, this is the inflection point, third derivative. Wait. No, second derivative equals 0 is the inflection point. First derivative equals 0 is min or max. So this is the inflection point. The second derivative of that total production is equal to 0. So the rate of change, the rate that this is changing is changing. So up until this point, we've got those increasing marginal returns. That as we add more stuff, it ends up giving us more of that total product than before, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? If you're just running that Domino's place by yourself, running all the deliveries and everything like that, right? Then adding one worker is going to end up giving you a lot more of the total production than adding a worker later on down the line, right? Adding that same one worker ends up increasing production that much, whereas adding that same one worker when we're, let's say, somewhere over here, is barely going to increase production, right? So production is increased by the same amount of input. The production is increased to a greater degree at the beginning, right? When we don't have a lot of laborers in there. And then as soon as we start to hire more and more laborers, we enter a period of diminishing marginal returns. And then what would we call the part of the graph on the far right? What would we call that part of the graph on the far right there? We call them decreasing marginal returns, or we could also call them negative marginal returns. Questions on that? All right. So, what are the other graphs that go with this, Chris? I'm so glad that you asked. How do we calculate the other graphs? Again, very glad that you asked. And so, we're not just going to. We're actually never really going to be looking at this graph. This graph is important for you to understand. It's important that you're able to tie it together with the next graph that I'm going to teach you. Okay, the next graph is talking about the marginal and average product. Okay, so this is the marginal product and the average product graph. This is again going to be on quantity of labor hours. I'm just going to say labor though. And so now it's going to be really clear for us to see the increasing returns, the diminishing returns, and the negative returns, right? Because we're going to be calculating, and so the book's already done it for us, right? And so we're going to be calculating the average and the marginal from this graph, right? And so I'll just do it for you guys for sake of time. Our average ends up being something where the cost of it, like at zero, the cost is zero, right? Because we're not making anything. And then it goes up 10, and then 15, and then kind of down around. This is our average costs. Sorry, production. Average production. How do we get this? Well, we're just taking this total production, right? So let's say this particular value right here, this is 15, right? So that means that this is 2.5, you can think of it at 2.5 thousand, right? So if this is the average production, right? And if average production is nothing more than my total production divided by my Q, then rearranging this, if I multiply both sides by Q, we end up with total production is equal to average production times Q. So we take that average production we found of 15, we multiply it by that 2.5, and that should be equal to whatever the value is at 2.5, which is looks to be about 37.5. This goes up to this graph, and that would make this production point right here 37.5. Why? Because that's 15 times 2.5. That's how these tie together. So my average production, I'm taking that total production and I'm dividing it by the quantity, right? In this case, the quantity was 2.5. So we could do a similar thing at quantity of 4. So let's see, a quantity of 4, my total is going to be 60. So what is the point? What's my average at 4? So if it's 60, what would this point be? I actually drew this wrong. 60 divided by 4 is 50. This should be like a 10 over here. This should be so how did we get that? We took that total production, we divided it by whatever the quantity was, and that gave us the average product equal to 15. When we're talking about the marginal product, so this is getting a little messy, so let's make a new one real quick. When we're talking about the marginal product, we're going to have that same total production curve. Now we're going to talk about what's the extra input that I get from adding that first amount of labor, right? So in our example, that the marginal product at 1 is the same as the total product. So at 1, it's going to be 10. So that means that when we're talking about the marginal revenue, how much extra revenue do I get from adding 10, or sorry, from adding 1 laborer? I get 10 extra product. I get 10 extra product from adding that 1 laborer, right? So it starts here, it starts at 10. This is where that one starts. Now, what's the next value? Well, at 2, my production goes to what? 25. So now on your own, I want you to calculate what's the marginal revenue of that second worker. How do we calculate marginal revenue? It's the change in our total revenue divided by the change in the quantity, right? I told you guys to be careful that the book's going to trick you and everything. I'm not going to trick you though. I'm just going to ask you about, just increases in 1 on the bottom, right? So for the most part, this is just going to be 1 on the bottom here, okay? Almost always this is equal to 1. It's not always, but almost always. So you really just have to look at the change in the total revenue, because that, anything divided by 1 is 1, right? So the change in the total revenue, 25 minus 10, is just going to be 15. This is 20, right? That's the start of my marginal revenue curve. In order to get the rest of my marginal revenue curve, I have to do calculations for each one of these things, right? So at 3, we've got 45 pizzas. What's our marginal revenue at 3? Got it out now, anyway. 20, right? 45 minus 25 is going to be 20. Very good. So at 3, just goes to 20. And then we keep on doing this. Uh, 60, 70, 75. So we end up with the marginal product of the 4th one, right? We only go from 45 to 60 now, so that's going to be back at 15. Marginal product of the 5th one, right? That goes from 60 to 70, right? So that's only going to be 10. And the marginal product from 5 to 6 is going to be what, only 5, since this is 70 to 75. And then what happens after we pass 6? At 7, it's still 75. So it doesn't change. And then at 8, it goes down to 70. Seven goes to 75. It stays at 75, just hangs out there. And at 8, it goes down to 70, right? At 8, you hired too many workers. They're distracting each other. You know, they're showing each other the latest thing on TikTok or whatever, right? When they should be, you know, going on runs. You know, I worked at a Chinese restaurant in Florida, so I know that definitely does happen. Delivery drivers will just talk with them. Be like, I got food here, it's getting cold, go. You know, but I mean, the people are the whole reason why we're either sucks or rocks, right? So you can't begrudge them too much. But what ends up happening, right, is that 7, the marginal product is 0, so it goes to 0. And then at 8, this is one of these few times in economics, right, where we actually go below the x-axis, right? We're actually going to a negative part here, right? Because at 8, we have a negative 5 marginal return, right? Because if we go from 7 to 8, our production goes from 75 to 70. And so it's actually pretty easy to see those different parts. Remember I was talking about, oh, you have to like spot the inflection point or whatever, right? You know, the second derivative. But I mean, when you look at the marginal revenue curve, it's easy. This is the increasing. You know, this is the decreasing. Or sorry, diminishing. And then this little part over here is the negative. Questions on that? Okay, so this is the notion about diminishing production. We're going to pick up in class on Thursday talking about the notion of diminishing costs. It's a similar thing. It's just talking about, instead of what I'm making, it's talking about what it takes to make the same amount of stuff. Okay, so we'll start with that on Thursday. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, shoot me an email, find the ops hours, make some new ops hours.